Hello, thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. We will be starting very shortly. We just need to let a few more folks in as people are still joining. So in the next 1 or 2 minutes, we are going to be starting. But thanks for joining us. All right. Yeah, so thank you so much. I think you guys can show yourselves. Great. Yeah, thanks again for joining in. My name is Chibo Arthur Anyaduba, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of English here in the University of Winnipeg. So I will be the moderator of today's event. Also to note that I am co-convening this event with Dr. Michael Eze of the Department of Chemistry. And we want to thank the Global College for its support of this event through the Masha Hanen Global Dialogue and Ethics Award. We also want to thank our invited speakers, whom I will be introducing to you shortly, and everyone working behind the scenes to ensure that we have a successful webinar. So I want to welcome you all again to today's webinar, which is the second webinar in the series on critical dialogues on policing in Canada. The Critical Dialogues webinar series aims to encourage conversations on policing in relation to knotty issues such as racism, justice, security, and so on in Canada and elsewhere in the world. And a major goal of the series is to enable a kind of space that is conducive to holding critical dialogues on policing. But before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Winnipeg sits in Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional homeland of Anishinaabe peoples. Treaty 1, signed in 1871, took this territory from 7 local Anishinaabe First Nations in order to make the land available for settler use and ownership. Yeah, that said, I think that this ritual of land acknowledgement works not only to highlight the colonial origins of our present conditions, but also to demonstrate the state of aporia that colonization has continued to generate for us. So today we can readily acknowledge the enduring wrongs of colonialism, yet we cannot redress these wrongs, right? And what then is the point of acknowledging wrongs that cannot be righted if it is not intended mainly as a rhetorical gesture? So I do not have an answer to that question, but I do hope that our conversation today will be much more than a rhetorical exercise or a symbolic gesture, particularly because the topic is, to me, of crucial importance. And the topic of today's webinar is Confronting Police Violence in Canada, Reforming, Defunding, Abolishing, you can add any other theme to that. And I think that this topic invites some form of collaborative reflection on the concrete ways to deal with the challenges that confront especially racialized peoples in Canada and elsewhere in the world. And to help us in this collaborative thinking, we have three powerful speakers whom I believe everyone knows or should know because of their celebrity status. Who doesn't know our first panelist, Alexa Joy, who has consistently pushed beyond the boundaries of social thought and public discourse. Alexa's work amplifies Black voices, critical race theory, and inquiries of race and intersectional oppression. Alexa's career started here in Winnipeg, formerly as the founder and president of Black Space Winnipeg, which is a group advocating for Winnipeg's Black communities. Alexa gained notoriety or fame for developing platforms to support Black people across Manitoba while fighting anti-Black racism. Alexa's contributions have been recognized through CBC's Future 40 Under 40, and she is the recipient of the 2017 CBO Shark Youth Award for Human Rights by Manitoba Human Rights Commission. Alexa is currently a graduate candidate at the New School for Social Research in New York, and most recently appointed as editorial intern at Public Seminar at the New School. Our second panelist is Michael Redhead Champagne, born and raised in Winnipeg's North End. Michael is an award-winning community organizer, public speaker, and a proud member of Shamatawa First Nation. Michael believes that we all have a gift, and he strives to show the youth the path to discover their own gifts. He is solution-oriented and passionate about building system literacy, encouraging volunteerism, and engaging communities to be involved in the design, delivery, and evaluation of any initiative that affects them. And our third panelist is Tiane Diop. Tiane holds an MA in Cultural Studies from the University of Winnipeg and a Bachelor of History from the University of Manitoba. Tiane has over 10 years of working experience in Winnipeg's arts and culture sector, in organizations ranging from museums and historic sites of literary, theatrical, and cultural festivals. As a long-standing member of Winnipeg's own Woke Comedy Collective, which seeks to amplify the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color performance artists, Tiane indulges her creativity through stand-up comedy and drag performances. When she is not on stage or in front of the camera, she can also be found enjoying quieter pastimes as an avid reader and intermittent writer. Tiane has always found that naming and deconstructing systemic oppression can be done just as well with a microphone as with a pen. All right, so to get things started, I have a few questions here for the panelists, but want first to remind those in the audience to use the Q&A or the chat function down at the bottom of the screen to post questions or comments or to contribute to the discussions at any stage in the conversation. Yeah. So my first question to the panelists is something basically about the topic. So how would you describe policing in Canada generally? And what is your understanding of police violence and policing in relation to racialized peoples? We can go in the order of the introduction.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's so good to be kind of back home virtually. So it's nice to see so many friendly faces. Big question. How would I define it? Might not be the most popular answer in the room, but definitely has roots in violence and genocide. I think what the BLM movement have showed us last year really in the death of George Floyd, which I always say is a public lynching, is that we can't afford to sweep these conversations and realities under the rug anymore. And specifically in a Canadian context, that we are, really challenging this myth that we're diverse and inclusive and celebrate each other in Canada, and not really getting to the real problems of structural white supremacy on both a community and a systemic level. So how would I define their relationship with Black folks, Indigenous, and other racialized people is purely on the foundation of violence and being antagonistic, assault. And I really don't have any kind of positive things to say in terms of their, stance on what they've done to people of color, Black folks in Winnipeg, from coast to coast. And I think that we're in a very important time where we can even have these conversations around defunding the police, reforming the police, redistributing resources and funds. But I think Canada, Manitoba specifically, is still very far behind in trying to push these conversations, and even exploring. A lot of people don't even know what defunding the police means, if I'm honest. They just, hear trending conversations and then they get jarred or uncomfortable or fragile without actually understanding the harm and the lives that are lost that came to this moment of why we're saying defunding the police.
That's great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alexa. I just want to say it's an honor to be here with such fantastic speakers, and welcome home, quotation. I don't know.
Thank you.
I don't know if this Zoom is the thing, but it's nice to see you in the Winnipeg world again.
You too.
So thank you for the important and gigantic question. I myself am from Shamattawa in northern Manitoba, and myself am a product of the child welfare system. And maybe just to build off of what Alexa has already said, I think the foundations of policing in Canada are on the foundations of displacement, and primarily displacement of Indigenous people from their land, displacement of Indigenous children from their families, displacement of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous family structures in general. And so that unfortunate basis of displacement puts us already in a very deficit situation when it comes to what is the state of policing in Canada. A lot of police forces in Canada will be quick to point to violence in America when it comes to police because it's flashier, it gets more attention without taking the critical perspective of looking inwardly at their own police forces and what needs to happen here. And I'm going to pick specifically on Winnipeg here for a moment, where we need to, I think, be realistic about what, as Alexa said, what defunding the police actually means. And I think that the advantage of Winnipeg right now is that we're a hotbed of Indigenous leadership in a way that we don't often see in other communities. And the focus of Indigenous leadership here in Winnipeg is something that I share often called Minopama Tsewin, or the good life. And we're seeking the good life for ourselves, for our relatives. And so we have to think about things like social determinants of health and prevention when it comes to community safety. If we're talking about the police, we're already too late. We need to be preventing the circumstances and situations that cause people to be in unsafe situations. And I think we have to be honest about the fact that, especially from like a medical and mental health and crisis perspective, we actually have to find a way to remove the police from that equation when people are in distress. Because in the past week, I've connected with a number of individuals and all of them have been women. I have to point out the fact that all of the people I've connected with in the last week have been women who have been failed by the police, failed by our healthcare system, and the police have been weaponized. The police have been weaponized to do wellness checks on people, and it doesn't help. So we have to think of something different. And right now, I think we are in a reckoning in Canada. But the only way that it's actually going to take hold is if we are able to take the attention that police forces and even mainstream media outlets are so quick to point over there, and get that attention pointing back inward to us and what's happening here in Winnipeg. Don't forget that in April of last year, 3 Indigenous people were killed by the Winnipeg police within a 10-day span. That's not over there. That's not someone else's problem. That's our problem here. And when we have Indigenous people represented in the youth incarceration numbers, when we have women overrepresented in incarceration numbers, when we have men Indigenous men overrepresented in these incarceration numbers, you can't tell me that we don't have a problem here where there is such a disproportionate rate of Indigenous people being incarcerated. And what I like to say is that policing is a continuation of the many systems of family separation that Canada thrives upon. And so, anyway, there's my thoughts.
Wow, thanks a lot. So much there, Tiani.
Right, so yeah, I want to thank the other 2 panelists for pointing out so many important things already. And I think I'm going to build a little bit off of what you were saying, Michael, to begin with, which is the histories of policing. So absolutely, there's the history of dispossession when it comes to Indigenous people in Canada. But when it comes to Black folks, the police in Canada, their original job was to like catch runaway slaves. And so there's a history there too, and that's the runaway slaves from either side of the border. And Canada likes to pretend like it hasn't had a history of slavery, but until the 1830s, it was legal to own slaves in Canada, and that's what the police force was doing alongside as the dispossession. And if we look a little bit closer at like the early 1900s, we have major hate organizations like the KKK and the Asiatic Exclusion League that are thriving in Canada, and the police isn't intervening there. And so kind of I'm pointing these out specifically because I think that the narrative that we're looking at coming from police today is always about public safety and public order. But who this public is has always been the same, and who the public isn't has also always been the same. And so I think that it's very clear that Black and brown bodies have always been excluded from the public that is meant to be kept safe by the police. These are the bodies that the police is policing to keep white folks safe. And yeah, I think that if we're going to like rethink and reframe that, we really have to understand kind of what the basis is there. One of the other things that I really want to talk about too is how this carries through. So all of these histories of kind of which groups were targeted, as you were saying, Michael, that there's the overrepresentation in incarceration, overrepresentation in police violence and police death for Black and Indigenous bodies in particular on this land. And that's because the police is really an arm of the settler colonial project that is ongoing on these lands. And so these histories aren't that far away. This is still what's trying to be maintained. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about demographics, because not only do we talk about over there, but we also like to talk about numbers a lot. And I think 2 cities that are important to put side by side would be Winnipeg and Toronto, which have huge issues in police violence and police brutality. But the numbers come out differently because the demographics are different. So we have an over-policing in the numbers of Black folks in Toronto and an over-policing in the numbers of Indigenous people in Winnipeg. But that doesn't mean that the Winnipeg police force is super nice to Black people and that the Toronto police force just like loves Indigenous folks, right? It just means that the numbers, because of demographics, aren't showing the baseline violence that is directed at both of these communities, but it is still important to remember that that is still true and still an everyday reality for people in those cities. Leave it at that, and I think we can circle back from there.
Wow, thanks so much for these powerful thoughts. So I heard the idea of policing as rooted in genocide and violence. And I heard the theme of displacement and the ways that the police is weaponized against racialized folks, especially Indigenous peoples. And I heard the theme of the establishment of police to catch those criminalized as fugitives, and so on. And these are really very profound points that you've raised. And if just to add to that, because one of the defining features of our internet social media moment, has been the regular exposition of shocking moments of police violence, mostly directed at racialized Blacks and Indigenous peoples. And these moments, if anything, have served to perhaps galvanize protests against racism and the kinds of policing that you've been talking about. So the question then is, to go straight on to the point about reforming, defunding, and abolishing. Where do you guys stand, given the very core points that you've made about the violent nature of policing in Canada? So what is your own view about reforming or defunding or abolishing? Anyone can jump in.
I'll guess we'll reverse the order. I'll go. So yeah, I think that one of the important things to remember is that even for white folks, like, police doesn't stop crime from happening. Like, even the communities that it is setting out to serve, policing doesn't prevent crime for the most part. Like, the stats show that, like, sometimes they come in afterwards and do like a half-assed investigation or something, but they aren't increasing safety in any meaningful way. Secondly, I think it's important to realize that policing takes up a huge part of municipal budgets, and Winnipeg is actually winner. If you look at the pie chart, we spend the most percentage-wise on police of any city in Canada. So huge portions of money go towards policing that doesn't actually doesn't keep anyone who's on this screen safe, but doesn't really keep anyone safe, to be honest, even though that's their slogan. And so for me, I think that I'm looking at a two-pronged approach. I think that, like, abolishing the police should be the goal, because the police in and of itself really is like part of the structure of settler colonialism, is a huge proponent of, like, causing harm and violence on other people. So, like, why would we want to try and reform it or make it slightly better? I think we should just get rid of it completely. But I think that we should get rid of it through defunding that is targeted to supporting organizations that have shown to make a difference in communities. So not just defunding and letting the people who already hold the purse strings make the decisions of where that money is going to go instead, but to put it towards community initiatives. In Winnipeg, we've got a couple that I can point to that do really great work, like Drag the Red, which is looking for missing and murdered Indigenous women in the Red River. The Bear Clan Patrol, other community initiatives that are harm reduction focused and have, like, an abolitionist mindset. There's so many great people who are already doing work in community that I would hate to see a defunding or an abolitionist viewpoint putting that money into things like social services, for example, which is, again, a really harmful part of community. So, like, I think that it needs to be very focused in the way that this happens.
Thank you so much for getting us started. I think that the answer to that question is all of the above. And I think it's like, kind of like I was saying before, the police really are supposed to be that last line of defense. And I'm really much more interested in creating the presence of community safety instead of funding these reactions, which is primarily what the police provide. Triggering reactions too, unsafe reactions that leave people dead sometimes. And so I'm like a mediator kind of person. And so, like, I will be one of the people who will have direct conversations with police officers in moments of tension to say, here are the things that I'm hearing in community that I feel like you need to know. I feel like having those direct conversations is important. And one of the things that, when I think about reforming and abolitionism, getting rid of the police, I think that we really have to take a look at some of the great resources in our local communities that are exactly, as was identified, doing the work of creating safety. And so for us, in Winnipeg's inner city, one of the things I think that is important for us to acknowledge is the alternative to a wellness check. That's the number one thing that we need on a very urgent basis, an alternative to wellness checks. Okay, and if you want to connect the policing situation to what's happening with security guards, which are like quasi-private police forces as well, who often, will do the work of protecting the building or protecting the private land, despite any human situations that maybe are happening there. And so I'm working with people that are advocating for alternatives specifically, and working on designing Indigenous value-based, community-oriented, harm reduction, focused, culturally safe initiatives. And so this includes advocating at the municipal level for things like safe consumption sites. We know a lot of the tension that is happening between community and police is relating to drugs. Let's just be honest. So what we have to do is we got to decriminalize all the drugs, start treating people that are struggling with addictions in the actual health system, which at a provincial level, you talked about how the police, at the city level, the police eat up all the municipal budget. At the provincial level, it's the health departments that eat up all the budgets in a very similar way. And the violence that comes at the healthcare system, I think, is often very directly connected in correlation to what happens in policing. And so both provincially and municipally, I think we have to take a look at the biggest offenders financially who are taking away these prevention situations, right? The prevention services that create safety in our community. And so I'm not saying defund healthcare system, but what I am saying is we need to build system literacy amongst our citizens. We need our community members and individuals to hold elected officials at different levels of government to account in every way. So we need more system literacy. We need the general community member to understand what is in municipal jurisdiction, how the budget process works at the city level, and the same thing for the province, and the same thing with the feds. And so that's a lot of education that is not happening in our schools, that I'm grateful to the community organizations for taking it on themselves. I want to give props right now to the Communities Not Cuts. They're doing an amazing job right now in Winnipeg, educating people about some provincial shenanigans that are very disrespectful to community. And I think that if we want an informed community that is involved in system solutions, then we need our systems to be forthright with us, to tell us what's happening, not happening at the provincial level. But I also think we have to amplify the solutions that are identified by community. And in Winnipeg, there's something called the Police Accountability Coalition that has nearly 100 or over 100 at this point, community organizations that do that life-saving work, and have identified 23 specific items that the police can start picking away at about how they can start showing support to community. And one of those items is defunding themselves by 10%. I think that would be a great gesture of appreciation for the police to say, we're going to take 10% of our budget immediately and allocate it to community to designate safety as they see fit. 10% is very small, but got to start somewhere. So I don't know. Maybe we do more. Maybe I'll push for 10% and someone else is going to push for 50%, and then we end up with whatever. So we need everyone. And that's the last thing that I'll say. We need everyone. We need the people that are in the systems pushing. We need our relatives that are outside protesting, kicking the door down, burning shit down. Like, we need everybody who is both on the outside protesting and recommending and amplifying the voices of community members that are not heard. The ones that are in the systems and the ones that are building the alternatives. Okay, so we need every single role in the movement to actually create community safety. And if we create that community safety, then we don't need to fund the police at these exorbitant levels.
Great. Alexa?
Yeah, I mean, beautifully said, both Michael and Diane. Like, it's hard to add to that, but just to kind of pick up where they both left off, that's absolutely true. Like, if you go on their website, they say that their budget from 2020 to 2023, started at 289 million and had a $40 million increase by 2023 to $313 million for the Winnipeg Police. That's a good chunk of change that I definitely think can be redistributed to the grassroots initiatives in the city. And, it's hard to talk about police defunding and abolition again when, as Michael kind of pointed out, there's not that community level of knowledge. Like, what does this actually mean? Because I remember I did an episode with Mandela Quetz and Elle Jones on Uncensored. And Elle was very, you know, passionate about the fact that, yeah, we can talk about defunding the police in Canada, but like, where do people actually understand why and where that's coming from? So I think the way I'm trying to approach this is just like a basic level of history, like an education, like why this isn't a coincidence. Black and Indigenous people getting killed by the police is a, you know, long-standing practice by the states, by the province, by the city, whatever level of, if you're talking about RCMP or, you know, your local police department, that's a practice, you know, and it's not a coincidence either. These happen. And I'd like to even just shift gears a bit to, you know, Machwar Madut, who was a South Sudanese man shot and killed in his own apartment in Winnipeg in 2019 in February, and Sandy Dang and the South Sudanese community who were working so hard to bring justice to this man's life have still not received any type of justice. And the police officer, which I still don't know his name, was let off without any type of accountability. You know, the same happened, I believe, with is it Eric Green? He was a young Indigenous man who was killed in police custody, I think.
Errol Green.
Errol, thank you. And you know, like things we've seen, and that's why I get really frustrated when Winnipeggers specifically like, well, that happens in Toronto, you know, they always go to Toronto. It's like, no, this is actually happening in our own community. And if you had, which I think was a some performance going on here. You had like thousands of people come to the rally for justice for Black lives in the summertime, right? Where are these numbers, you know, with Machwar and Errol, when we need that kind of momentum when it comes to getting justice for Black and Indigenous people who are murdered by the police, by the Winnipeg Police Department, by the state itself. So I express my cynicism and skepticism when we saw such large numbers and the type of, I've said before, there's harm everywhere in this world, right? It's not to take away from the lives of George Floyd and Black people who have died in the States, in Toronto, wherever it might be. But if these things are happening in your own community and you choose to ignore it and you focus your direction on the US or Toronto or anything that's not in your backyard, I call bullshit. And I think until we see justice for Black and Indigenous people who have lost their lives, who are murdered, assaulted, every word in the book by the Winnipeg Police Department, then it's not going to get better. And I really don't think Winnipeg's at a place where, you know, at least the mainstream to really push these conversations, because there's such a overwhelming display of complacency, you know, well, things aren't that bad here, you know, let's just live with it. And it's like, no, people's lives will never be the same. You know, I've known close friends who've been assaulted and interrogated and bullied by the police, people in my family. It's just because we're not hearing more about it doesn't mean it's not happening. And to Theane's point too, and Michael, like the media outlets is the biggest shortcomings. CBC Manitoba has a lot of work to do. And I recognize that, and the hat that I wear working with CBC in arm's length, because like I think I know how many stories I've seen about police brutality in Winnipeg come from CBC, and it's not a lot. So the media too has a problem in perpetuating all these problems in the US and not looking at our back door in our backyards.
Great. Tiene, you want to add something?
I did. Thank you for giving me an extra second. So I noticed on my notes that I missed something that is quite important, which is that when I'm thinking about policing, it's not just like municipal police and the RCMP, but I think that another key point of the conversation around policing has to be around immigration detention, as well as the use of CSIS in the Canadian context. Because this whole idea of keeping us safe from them doesn't just happen between communities, but also at our borders. And that comes back to talking about like the settler colonial context. And if we bring it to the settler colonial context, that means that we are also part of a nation that goes and destroys other nations to make them unlivable. And then when people try and come here to live here, they are policed at the borders, and that's not okay. And so when we're talking about abolishing and defunding, I think that needs to be a key component of the conversation. And lastly, I think that if we're talking about policing, I don't think that we should just abolish like the existence of these bodies, but also that we need to abolish the idea of policing, of the need to look so closely at kind of what other people are doing and try and like put our fingers in what's right and what's wrong and who needs to be incarcerated and all that. Like that whole mentality needs to go as a whole. Otherwise, whatever is going to come after it is just going to be a reiteration of the exact same thing.
Well, that's a very important point, I think. I think Michael made a similar point about policing beyond the idea of the police force. Where communities are policed through the healthcare institutions, and even through schools, right? So the very idea of policing and the ways that we are governed, I think, are part of the question that we are dealing with here. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. The first question is, how do we make this concept of defunding the police scary and more palatable to the wider audience? Do we need to make this concept scary or more palatable?
Maybe I'll just quickly jump in because I'm like I feel like a lot of what I do is like translating. And so I do agree that we have to continue to educate, as has been happening, about what defunding the police means. But for me, one of the things that I've learned in community organizing is it's great to start when you know what you're against. But somewhere along the way, you have to transition into the thing that you believe in, into the thing that you actually want. So saying that this is what I don't want is important. We have to say it. But I think the way we make it less scary, more palatable for people, is by clearly identifying what we do want. And I think that's why I began today by talking about that traditional concept in my culture of of the good life. The reason why I spoke about that is because if we want if we want all of our relatives in Winnipeg to have a good life, we have to create safety for them. And creating safety doesn't always mean more police. Actually, it usually never means more police. Creating safety means like providing people with the basic needs that they are required. People need food, people need water, people need shelter, people need safe socialization. And I'm thinking about all of our relatives that are out there right now. Thank goodness it's getting warmer in Winnipeg now, but we're just coming out of the polar vortex, and this really bizarre conversation in the city about like people in bus shacks in the cold. And there's a real prone to policing bend to the way that folks on social media seem to be reacting to individuals in bus shacks. And I think it's important for us to talk about, like, we got to create safety. We have to create opportunity. We have to, like, we got to do a better job if we got people sleeping in bus shacks. Like, that is a reflection of us as a community. And to me, the way to make defunding the police less scary is by talking about the thing that we believe in. And that's people are safe, people are respected, and a world where we don't actually need the police. We don't need them because our basic needs are met. And we have like community-based alternatives to create the safety that we require. And thank you, Thiane, for your name drop in all the community organizations like Drag the Red, like Bear Clan, like Mama Bear. Those are the organizations that make me feel safe in Winnipeg.
And just to, there's a question that relates very closely to this. Thanks a lot for those thoughts, Michael. So Rebecca says, for everyone, that's for this question, but branching off of Alexa's comment, I am a journalism student who is a staff writer for an online publication. I am currently in the process of writing a story about the police aggression and funding in Winnipeg. My question is, what do you think the media needs to hit the hardest on when covering these kinds of topics? And just to add to that, why should talking about defunding the police or abolishing be a scary thing? And anyone can, okay, yeah, Tiani, go ahead.
I just want to jump in with the first part of the question about whether we want to be palatable or be scary when we're talking about like abolishing the police. And I think that there's something that's going unsaid in that question because it assumes that abolishing the police is going to be scary for any audience. But for me, it isn't scary to talk about abolishing the police. It would actually make me feel more safe. So it's centering whiteness in a certain way without even addressing it in the question, because we're wanting to make sure that the people who have been fed the lie that the police protects them are going to be comfortable in the dismantling of that organization, essentially. And I really don't have much interest in that. I think that it would be important to maybe educate people about why it is that they think that police equals safety, and then deconstructing that with them. Not work that I'm interested in doing, but if there are more patient people out there, that's something that they can take on. But I think that kind of dichotomy of like, it's either scary or we're pandering to whiteness is like a false equivalent. And yeah, it also just kind of assumes something in the question that I think there's enough people that feel safer without police, and that we're kind of completely erasing that demographic and like the interests of those people and the ability of those people to push for change by posing the question in that way.
Alexa, do you want? Okay.
I can briefly to the media question. I mean, I've learned a lot doing freelance work at the CBC, to say the least. I've learned a lot. What I will say is that I think there is, I think because there's a dominant narrative in Canadian media that they do not want to rock the boat. Like I said, the branding of this country, they've done a good job in, portraying that we're inclusive and diverse and free of discrimination. We're all good in Canada. And how I want to move forward, and that's why it's hard to have these conversations on air, because you don't know who you're reaching, and you also don't want to put your guests in a vulnerable position either. But at the same time, there's not enough that's being done on a media level platform to really get these stories out into the community. And when they do, they often approach it from a journalistic perspective where they're neutral. They can't pick a side, they can't kind of explore or expand on the wrong or the trauma that's been caused. And I'm not interested in that type of journalism, especially the work that I'm doing at the New School and what I'm learning from my American colleagues who are really pushing the boundaries on radical storytelling and journalism. It's very inspiring, to work with folks in that environment, because, if we're not calling truth to power and holding our institutions and politicians and chief of police accountable for the pain and harm that's been caused on an institutional level to community, I don't think we're doing our job as journalists, as community activists, organizers, but at the same time, it's not easy. It's not easy to take on an institution. I think every panelist here knows that. We've all been there. We've all been ostracized and public enemy number one. But I'm comfortable. I'm not trying to be the most popular person in the room. I never have been. But what I'm interested in seeing now is radical storytelling, whether that's from Michael or Thiane, or the work that's being done in any kind of grassroots level in Winnipeg or across the country. It's these people, it's activists and community organizers and elders and people from the community who maybe don't have a PhD or who is not an expert, getting the real community reactions that we don't hear. And again, it's not a coincidence. It's systemic, it's intentional.
And maybe very quickly, just to add to that, further to the media situation, I love the question about like, what does media need to be covering more of? Cover more of the solution. That's the answer. I bet you when you do interviews with people who have experienced police violence, they'll say to you, this is what would have helped me instead. Why don't you ever publish that? How come that's never the headline? How come it's never, this would have helped me in this situation? So very quickly, that's just what I wanted to add. I really believe that media needs to quit being so problem-based in the way that they cover every story, being like, how can I like put more eyeballs on this wound? Instead of that, I would love if the media was like, how can I get more eyeballs on this solution, on this medication, on this, you know, whether it's a Band-Aid or a surgery, whatever it may be. We need to get more eyes on the solution. And right now, the media seems to be content with highlighting the shit that we live every day. And I don't want to read media that is like super re-triggering to me, but I would love to read media that says, here's a problem, here's what the community identified as a solution, here's what they're doing about it, and here's how anyone who wants to help can get involved. I know that that's like totally altering the media to be more activist-y, but why shouldn't it be that way? Why shouldn't we be inviting people to participate in constructing new solutions to create community safety and wellness for everybody? Why not?
And just to add with the media piece, I think that I really like what both of you are saying about how like a lot of the times the media is trying to be like objective and like not pick a side or anything. But I think that we also have to be honest about just how many news reports about, say, police violence comfortably dehumanize the victims of police violence and police brutality while still claiming objectivity. And so it's not even a like, oh, we're trying to represent both sides equally. Like there are many ways in which reporting exacerbates the situation and actually like feeds the narrative of we need more police and we need more police funding. Like if we look in Winnipeg, one thing that I can point to directly was a couple years ago when there were a lot, like not even a lot, a couple like liquor store robberies, and the way in which the media picked that up and how now there is a police officer at pretty much every liquor store that you go to, including there's a liquor store in the grocery store by where I live. And so when I go do my groceries, I run into a police officer every single time that I go in and out of that store, and that's been normalized in some way. And I'm sure that a huge part of that was the way in which the media coverage took place. So like, I really like what you're saying, Michael, about like, why aren't we covering the things that do work in community instead of letting the media be a part of continuing the over-policing in our communities.
There's a question here that probably also highlights some of these points. It's from Katrina. Say, how would you discuss the context of defunding the police in the perspective of immigrants? Because some immigrants come from a background that has an understanding of just following the law, police included, and everything will be safe and they will be protected. I think I can respond to this. And briefly, it's just to recognize that when we talk about the police institution as a very as rooted strongly in colonialism, is to recognize that many of these countries also had police institutions that are rooted in the same history of colonization as the one you have in Canada here. In Nigeria, where I come from, the Nigerian police system is very strongly colonial. And understand that the police was used to colonize peoples in virtually every part of the world. So that colonial history of policing, say in Africa or in any other part of the world, is still very much present. Yeah, it's just to chip that in. So this conversation is not really specific to Canada. It's more broadly encompassing in that sense.
And I think that there's also like part of this narrative of like, oh, if you just, the one thing that I picked up in that question was like, if you just do what you're supposed to do, the police won't interact with you, which is like a bullshit narrative that's sold to try and like further like ostracize and criminalize people who do have regular contact with the police. And I think that one of the things that we need to do is to like unpack the narratives of like what the histories of policing are, but also get a little bit more comfortable of unpacking victim blaming in our society, because so many people try to distance themselves from things that like might be really close to their reality but isn't quite their reality, by victim blaming. And I think that that's something that really, really happens in policing, and that I've seen a lot of times by people who might also be marginalized but haven't directly experienced police violence in the place where they are now. And then instead of accepting that it very easily could have been them too, displacing that discomfort by blaming the people who did have the bad police interaction.
My friend Mandela, and Alexa mentioned him earlier, has shared with me some teachings about restorative justice. And I feel like there's a real strong connection in values from like Indigenous folks here in Turtle Island, and our relatives from Africa, and many other Indigenous groups from around the world. And so one of the things I think that could help us in this conversation is talking about restorative justice and asking, is that what the police bring? Because 99.999999999, possibly 100% of the time, that's not the police. And I think that I just try to give them like a shred of like credit. Like I just hope for something good from them. And every time it's like, nope. Anyway, it just becomes really important, I think, for us to emphasize those solutions again, right? And I think restorative justice is the solution. And if we're not getting it from the police, we need to put our budgets where the solutions are.
There are two questions here that I think we can take together. The first is something we've already touched on. Besides impact of colonialism and white supremacy, how does the formation of Canadian identity contribute to the idea of policing in contemporary Canadian context? And the next question, it's more or less a comment. It says, along with the RCMP were created just to take First Nations children from their families to go to residential schools. So basically, the idea that the Canadian identity, is strongly implicated in what we are actually talking about in terms of policing. So if I can make it more or less a philosophical question, how can we defund, reform, or abolish policing in the ways that each of you has highlighted very powerfully? How can we do this within the same colonial structure that created the very conditions enabling this conversation in the first place, right? Can we abolish the police in Canada when the idea of Canadianness itself is constituted by that policing? There has to be policing for Canada to exist, right?
I can touch on this a bit. I mean, it's very complicated. We all know what it's like to work in the system, but work against it at the same time. And I think it's a larger question. This, like you kind of pointed out, Canadian narrative, that everything is okay here. I honestly think that's where a lot of the work needs to begin. But as all the panelists, kind of pointed out, like, we know what it's like to be on the other end of police brutality. Folks, white people, anyone with, privilege, whatever that privilege might be, I think, and I'll always go back to this, really have to be a part of the, solution, because we can bang on the door all we want until we have, I think, a collective, push for defunding the police, like in short, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think this country will ever dismantle the RCMP or different police departments across the country, because it is ingrained in our in the making and the establishment of the state, of the province, of the country. So hopefully we can get to a place where, and we hear these. What's really funny? We're seeing a lot of this like diversity politics where we have a Black chief of police and we have an Indigenous this, and that is just like a I don't know, a band-aid over that. What I always say, if we're not all at the table, we're not at the table. One Black person sitting at the table isn't going to do anything. I was on a panel the other day with Devon Clunis, and he said something quite interesting, where he said, maybe if I'm naive, but I didn't experience any racism in the police force. And I'm like, brother Clunis, I promise you went through some shit. You maybe suppressed it to deal with being the first Black chief of police in Manitoba, and I think now he's in Ontario. But that's like when the same equivalent when a woman would say to me in the past, like, "Oh, I've never been sexually assaulted." Statistically, 1 in 3 women, that's within your lifetime, you do, right? So when we're talking about defunding the police, and like I bring these all up to point out that the system isn't stupid. It will reshape and manifest to make it appear as though it's changing and inclusive, but it's working the way it's supposed to work, the way it governs itself. So to answer, no, I don't think the police will be abolished in this country, unfortunately. Is this something we can work to? For sure. But it's going to come with an extreme demonstration from all ends. And, I said this before, we're working on, I'm doing research on neglected communities in New York, specifically in the South Bronx. And if anyone knows the history about the South Bronx, basically the New York police department in the state in the 70s just like started blowing up and putting buildings on fire in the South Bronx and displacing Latinx and Black communities. There's a great documentary called Decade of Fire, if anyone's interested. And I'm taking that and putting it into this context because communities of color are always, whether in the States or in Canada, the most neglected and vulnerable under, state authority and violence and policing, whatever type of, harm that happens on a state level. And I think that Canada is not ready. I think we all know this. We know what it's like growing up in Winnipeg. Y'all are working in there right now. I don't think much has changed, even from the summer, even from the work that all of us have done. Like maybe the needle's been pushed a bit forward, but until a problem is a white person's problem, then we will still be neglected and unheard.
Alexa, thank you so much. And I want to acknowledge another comment in my answer because it's very relevant. There's a comment in our chat from Richard about coming from a police background and working in a community organization and struggling with the idea of promoting community policing and defunding the police at the same time. How can we do that? We can't. We can't. And I'm somebody who used to be a big advocate for community policing. Once upon a time, I was on the little committee that said, yeah, sure, we should have school resource officers in schools. I now can, things change. I learn about systems. I've seen damage happen in my community, and I no longer believe that that's an appropriate use of police time, school resource officers. I don't think that that's appropriate anymore. And the other thing about community policing, while I do appreciate the relationships I've been able to build with some of the folks involved in community policing, I would argue that most of community policing is paying police officers to do community work that community organizations are a better place to do. And I mentioned to Danny Smythe the last time I spoke to him about this concept of mission creep with the police. And I've been hearing a lot of people say, well, school resource officers are great because they help, like, they're like extra coach, or they're like helping with the homework, or they're doing like whatever their reasoning is. But all of the reasons that are listed are all things that educational assistants could be doing, community nonprofits are well suited to be doing. There's a whole association called the Restorative Justice Association of Manitoba if there's conflict in schools, so we can try to improve more restorative practices there. And so that's where those dollars that are paying police wages and community policing should be redirected to. So anyway, I used to be someone who was all about community policing. Now I don't think that we can do community policing and defunding the police at the same time. Now what I think is the police need to be allies to the community, which again, we'll just leave that sentence for what it is. And the police need to, in a show of good faith, say, we recognize that the community is better served to do some of this stuff, and we willingly give up some of our budget for that. And I know that that's not popular, and I don't think that that's going to happen, but I feel like that's the only way. I feel like the police have to say, here's a portion of our budget to make our own life easier.
I'm going to also go back a little bit to the original question that had to do with like Canadian identity and policing. And so yeah, I think that we already talked extensively at like who is being policed and what the histories of those are and why. But I think that another important part is that like our Canadian identity is built on things that we have like positive emotional associations with, like multiculturalism, which Alexa, you pointed to several times. But I want to look at multiculturalism more specifically because that's a policy that came in like the 1960s and 70s, and it was in response to two things. It was directly in response to a lot of Indigenous organizing on these lands and to try and remove focus from uprisings that were going on here and to brand the country with a new narrative. So again, ensuring that the status quo was upheld. And also around the time when there was a lot of eyes on what was going on in South Africa with apartheid. And so Canada, another settler colonial nation that was very much steeped in white supremacy, that had a lot of the policies that were the foundations of apartheid in South Africa actually came from the Canadian system. So Canada was like, quick, we need a rebrand. Let's talk about multiculturalism. And so these ideas are like connected to policing, but they're also connected to another thing. In Canada, we don't really like race-based data. We're like afraid of it, but it would tell us a lot more of these stories of kind of who's targeted and why. But instead we're like, oh no, we're all together, we're part of the mosaic. We don't need to look specifically at how we enact violence on specific communities. And so yeah, I think we need to divest from these parts of our Canadian identity that seem to be innocuous and that seem to be like really comforting and great, because they actually are enacting violence in and of themselves and are hiding other types of violences. That's one thing that I think that we should do. And then for the philosophical question of kind of, would we be able to abolish policing in Canada as it stands now? I unfortunately would have to agree with Alexa that no, I don't think so. But I think that we also forget how quickly things can change and how quickly things can look different. So just because our current settler colonial state, which it is, it's 100% still invested in settlerism and colonialism, that is relatively young and hasn't been around forever and might not always be around in this shape. So I don't think that we need to be completely hopeless if we're saying that with these conditions now, we wouldn't be able to see the abolishment of police. We're all really great imaginative people. We can imagine different and better things and still have the possibility to create the change we want to see.
Great. There's one more question here. SROs, and I think that should be self-regulatory organizations, right? Yeah. So SROs are not good for community. They don't do anything for the community. If we take away the police in schools, what will be the replacement?
Can you repeat that?
So the question is, if we take away police from the schools, what will be the replacement?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, first we have to ask, why are police in schools in the first place? right? And where are these police? Because we all know that they're in Point Douglas and they're not in these rich white communities. If I could be so blunt. So it's racialized, right? In certain demographics, different regions in the city, you're going to see higher police in schools. I would challenge that and really, I think, pick on what both Michael and Thiane have pointed out of this idea of restorative community building and justice. There is no need for police to, for what reason? I don't understand how you can have a police presence in a high school or middle school or elementary school. That's serious. And that's also conditioning kids to what environment are you growing up in if that's the first thing you come to school and see a police officer. That makes no sense to me. So I would really encourage this dialogue to go in a place where, you know, why are these police here in the first place? And why can't we imagine an environment, a school environment without policing? I think they have no place in school whatsoever. And I'm sure I'll pass it on to the panelists who might agree with me.
By the way, SRO means school resource officers. Thanks, Mary.
All right, I'll go. Yeah, I agree. I think, well, the question is kind of hilarious to me too, because I'm like, I have seen a lot of schools in Winnipeg that don't have school resource officers in them, all in more affluent neighborhoods. And so like, how is it that we can't imagine what that would look like when currently that is the case for people who are fortunate enough to like have enough money to not be criminalized? Like, for one. And then for two, like, I think that we also need to talk about the fact that these are schools, these are kids that we're talking about, they're children, but we have to also be aware of the fact that childhood is like a construct that isn't often afforded to young Black and brown kids, that they're often treated as though they're older than they actually are. They're often criminalized at a much younger age, they're surveilled at a much younger age. And so this like, why can't we afford the same kind of liberties and space to like explore what it means to be a person to Black and brown children? Like, why is that so difficult for us to understand? And why is that scary? That's the other thing. Why are Black and brown children scary to you? I think that there are a lot of questions that I have for the person who posed this question.
Thank you both very much for your answers. And thank you, Mary. I think it is an important question, right? Because a lot of people, if they have that baseline of like school resource officers right now, what do we replace them with? It already kind of puts us in a little bit of a deficit from a community perspective. And so what I think is that there are local examples in every community of how to create safety, if that's what we're trying to do. If we're to create safety in schools, there are ways to do it. How about breakfast programs? Hungry people tend not to fight each other as much. I know, radical. Other things that we can include, conflict resolution that are restorative justice in nature, right? I don't know that police officers facilitate restorative justice circles, but there is many community organizations and the RJAM, Restorative Justice Association of Manitoba, that do. So they would be well suited. And one thing that's great is that when you engage community organizations, it also helps with like local employment. You can hire like one of the parents of the kids and they can come be in the school, and it like increases community cohesiveness, supports local employment, blah, blah, blah. And so I think there are many opportunities for us to replace school resource officers with things that actually create the safety that we desire. And a lot of that, I think, is the answers are already in our communities, but we have to actually listen to them at a system level, and systems tend to be pretty bad at that. And I'll just elevate quickly that Fearless R2W, the group that I work with, and Mary actually, full disclosure, also works with us. We are developing a community safety host initiative to displace security guards that are, making medical environments, and many other city Winnipeg environments, etc., libraries, unsafe for people. And so we're trying to create a community-based alternative that supports employment, but also creates safety. And we will gladly accept 10% of the police's budget to make that happen. Just have to throw that out.
And I think I should also add, I really like, Michael, that you were naming like some alternative programs that would be better placed in schools. If we're talking about defunding and abolition, there would be so many funds that would be opened up to try and like put resources into the education system to actually like help young people rather than criminalize them and to fortify the school to pipeline or the school to prison pipeline.
Okay, one more question here. Thank you for your work and thank you for this panel and conversation. That's from Faustine. People in general have completely internalized the idea that policing is the only way to ensure community safety. Through your work and conversations, how have you managed to make people understand that policing is in fact a hindrance to community development? And I think you guys have touched on this earlier on, but if you could speak to that question again.
I think one thing that really struck me, I think it was AOC, the Democratic senator in the US who made this point, that was saying like, it's not that difficult to imagine what it would look like to put more money into community than into policing. You just have to look at the suburbs. Like those examples already exist of healthy communities with schools that are well funded and with hardly a police officer or police car in sight. But then if you look at other neighborhoods in the city, it's a very, very different picture. So I think that just pointing to the spaces that already exist and like the people who are already afforded like the humanity and the space to exist in the way that they want to is an easy way to get people to understand that it might be a better model, especially if the people come from those spaces and enjoyed their time in those spaces.
Maybe I'll just quickly add that through the conversations and the work that I've done, the way that I've communicated to people that policing is a hindrance to community is by sharing stories. It's the only way that I know how to communicate things. And there are just so many reoccurring stories on a regular basis that I never run out. And that's heartbreaking. That's why when I first began, I talked about how wellness checks, very specifically, I want to pick on those. It's urgent, and it will be life-saving if in Winnipeg we can find a non-police alternative to wellness checks. We have a responsibility to our community members to find a better way. And so for me, I'm able to communicate solutions that just resonate with the community, like, because I'm listening to the things that they want. And so again, like going back, and I'm sorry to be so repetitive about this, but the Indigenous, the First Nations teachings that have been shared with me are such a beautiful North Star in terms of what I'm actually working towards. I'm working towards a good life for everyone. Everyone needs housing, everyone needs love, everyone needs education, everyone needs food, everyone needs safety, everyone needs water. That's what I'm working towards. And guess what? That sounds way better. I didn't say police one time in what I'm working towards. And so I think it's if I just explain like these are the things. Oh, and there's books. Like here's one. Oh, look, how convenient. The Social Determinants of Health in Manitoba. There, that's what we got to do. And people like thinking, I believe that people would rather have solutions than have a problem. And there's so many great solutions out there. And so to me, that's always the way that I've been able to convince people, because I have the stories that prove that the police are ill-suited to respond in many crisis situations. And then we also have community involved in a lot of co-creating of their own solutions based on safety in many different environments. And so there are I can imagine many different ways to explain to people many, many ways to explain to people how defunding the police is a good thing.
There's another question here, which I think should be the last. It's from Richard, and it's part of what Michael has already mentioned. Richard says, I think the problem of policing comes from, to quote, the skin we are in, regardless of who is policing us. So if we follow this line of argument, we should then defund even other organizations such as schools, social services, and so on. Any further thoughts?
I could jump in here. I mean, and just to kind of also acknowledge the last question. It's hard because, you know, this year was interesting. I saw a number of activists I've known across the country who stepped away from the movement for their mental health. The work that we do is not easy, right? Activists, organizers, you know, whatever your title is. And I think that in the conversation of defunding and challenging the police, people don't really know the depths of what activists go through, I think, and what community goes through. And when I say people, I'm like talking again, folks outside of the vulnerable communities that are impacted by, you know, violence on a municipal or provincial level, whatever that looks like. But to go back to the skin we're in, this comment, obviously Desmond Cole's book was a great tool in kind of tracking, you know, anti-Blackness throughout Canada from, like, I think it was 2017. He looks at 3 years, 2016 to like 2020. And, you know, Robin Maynard too, former Winnipegger, policing Black lives. Two great resources that we can always look to really challenge this, you know, myth that anti-Blackness and white supremacy and anti-Indigenous racism doesn't exist in Canada. Obviously it does. But, you know, where I'm at, I think in my activism and career, I'm very passionate to ensure that these stories, like kind of Michael brought up, are, you know, being discussed regularly, openly, raw, organic, and, you know, to even think about moving to a future where the police is abolished or doesn't exist, is going to come through a hard but revolutionary act. We all know systems never change. Governments do not change until pressure from the public is applied, you know, and we have to be as loud and vocal and, you know, deliberate and strategic in our efforts. And unfortunately, I think there needs to be more of us who share these sentiments, like the panelists, and, you know, questions being asked to really alter this dynamic in Canada. I do not think we're there yet. I think we're quite literally at the surface, but, you know, we've seen the radical movements throughout Canadian history, and I hope that we continue that. But I don't think we all know the answer will not be solved tomorrow, you know. And even kind of going on Michael, what he said, problem and solution, I think we're always seen as a problem to the mainstream white Canadian population. I think we're a problem, and they don't know how to solve the problem. So I'll leave it at there.
We used to solve it through genocide, right? Anyway, thank you so much for this illuminating session. It's been really very interesting. And it's just to add to what Alexa was talking about, is to realize that what we are dealing with here at the core of it is racism, and that racism kills, right? And that it kills in different ways. And the policing aspect of it helps us to understand the very severe implications of racism, not just here, but in the world generally. But thank you so much for these powerful reflections. And I hope that when I invite you the next time, you would join me once again to have more conversations on some of these issues. Thanks again to everyone who was able to join us, and to all the people behind the scene, making sure that this is happening successfully. Yeah, thanks.